the best races in Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires from an Autoresolve perspective. But before I talk about the races, I need to talk about how the Autoresolve works. It's calculating damage, and one of the things that matters as a result of how the system works is armor. So units with a higher level of armor, anything over 80 or similar to 80, will do better in Autoresolve than units below that. So even 60 armor wouldn't necessarily give you the best Autoresolve, but that is just one factor that comes into play. Leadership is also something that does tend to matter from my own personal perspective. So effectively, units that have low armor, low leadership tend to do the worst in Autoresolve. Units that have high armor, high leadership tend to do the best. But there's more to this subject than just that. Single entities don't tend to do very well. Flying units, it kind of depends. Sometimes they do exceptionally well, sometimes they don't do exceptionally well. It might come down to how the damage model is calculated, if the enemy has range. I'm not entirely certain with regards to flying units. With regards to single entities on foot, however, they do tend to take a significant amount of damage in Autoresolve. It's pretty ridiculous, not quite sure why, or exactly the way the system works. But it is worth pointing out, single entities tend to do pretty badly. However, monstrous infantry does tend to do better. It's a weird system. I don't know necessarily all the intricacies, only Creative Assembly could go over that. But one of the things I do know, beyond armor, is obviously heroes, lords, lord ranks, hero ranks, items. They do all play a role. But one of the things that matters the most beyond armor is having an army that is actually not varied. If you have an army like this, where you have a combination of ranged and melee units, this is actually not going to be the best in Autoresolve. It can be effective, but surprisingly, an army like this, for instance, might actually be better for the sake of Autoresolve, because it's pure melee. And so, having a couple of melee units, those melee units are going to take significantly more damage. If you have, let's say, 4-6 melee units and a bunch of range units, those melee units are going to take a lot of damage in the process. This is something that affects the High Elves, because High Elves can have a pretty solid Autoresolve, but their spearmen, 4-6 spearmen, are going to take a significant amount of damage. This creates a situation where you kind of want to have more melee than ranged infantry in an army to have a good Autoresolve. There are exceptions, certainly, to the rule, or you may not care if you're, say, playing a race or a lord that can instantly recruit a bunch of units to replace whatever losses they take in melee, or in the case of High Elves, you can easily recruit another spearman unit to replace the one that you just lost. Unit experience does matter. So in this case, you look at this battle, this army would do pretty well in Autoresolve, as you can see. This is on Legendary very hard. Another thing worth pointing out about Autoresolve, and one of the things I do detest, is that battle difficulty determines the Autoresolve result. This is absurd, as far as I see it, but it does determine that. So if you're playing on lower battle difficulty, you're going to get a better Autoresolve result. Beyond that, however, for both you and the AI, every single settlement has an Autoresolve benefit inherently. This is something you can abuse if you're playing with races that have high level of armor, think of the Dwarfs, to annihilate entire armies or legions of, say, Skaven, will have very low armor, if any armor whatsoever, on their units. It's just one of those ridiculous situations. But yeah, Autoresolve can really work in your way, in your favor, in a very significant way, if you understand how that works. So right here, for instance, I have the Autoresolve Quest Battle mod, and you can see that this army would be able to Autoresolve its way to victory. It is also worth pointing out that Autoresolve typically is going to inflict more serious casualties than if you fought the battle manually. So that's another thing that you gotta be aware of. Like, obviously, it would not be ideal if I did so. If I Autoresolved that battle, or fought that battle, and then, I had two Skaven armies over here. Though it is Skaven, so I might be able to Autoresolve my way through that. Anyway. So at number 5, we have the Dark Elves. The reason for the Dark Elves is, yes, they do have a bunch of units that may not necessarily have the best armor in the world. But every single Dark Elf campaign, to a degree or another, can get easy access to Black Ark Corsairs, because every single Dark Elf campaign can easily recruit a Black Ark, especially if you're pushing for it. And every single Black Ark at tier 1 will start with a barracks that allows you to recruit Black Ark Corsairs from tier 1. So you have a really solid melee infantry unit. It's not necessarily the best melee infantry unit in the game, but it's an 80 armor, high leadership unit that just gets the job done. So like you look at Black Ark Corsairs over here by default, like 66, leadership over here, 80 armor. In fact, if I look at it for the unit and spell browser, like, yeah, 66, 80 armor, that is a great unit for Autoresolve. Dark Shards with shields, interesting enough, I think shields do matter as well to a certain extent. Not quite sure how significant it is. It depends on what you're dealing with. Like, if you're dealing with a bunch of ranged units, and yeah, having shields on units, I think, matters. But Dark Shards with shields, they're not necessarily a great unit in terms of their armor, but range calculation are different than melee calculations. You can generally expect melee units to take more damage. So some of the best units in Autoresolve are melee units with high level of armor. Actually, the best army potentially could be an army with ranged units, purely ranged units, with a very high level of armor. The worst kind of army in Autoresolve would be a melee army with low level of armor. This is one of the reasons Norska gets screwed. Also, why Skaven gets screwed. Skaven may have units that can have a very high level of armor, but consider which units have a high level of armor for the Skaven. It's things like Warp Grinders. Warp Grinders are more of a support unit than a mainline unit. They're useful to have, they're important to have, but like Flamethrowers, Rattling Gunners, etc., those are not units necessarily you want to just completely spam without other units as well. The problem is those other units may take a significant amount of damage in the process. So maybe that is a very Skaven way to play. Lose a lot of units in every battle, except Total War doesn't work like that. So yeah, Skaven don't have a good auto-resolve. Dark Elves have a really good auto-resolve in their campaign. Another thing to also consider is multiple armies. So it's not just a question of individual units that makes a race really good in an auto-resolve. It's how easy can you recruit those units? How good is your casualty replenishment? Because regardless of what auto-resolve you have, you need to replenish those losses. This is one of the reasons why Cafe is not a good race for auto-resolve, because yes, Cafe does have heavily armored units, but not necessarily as heavily armored as Dark Elves, but they do lack casualty replenishment. And also the fact that Cafe and armies tend to be hybrid armies of ranged and melee units does actually hurt them quite a bit in the auto-resolve result. So in theory, a race like Cafe could have a good auto-resolve, but in practice they don't. Lack of casualty replenishment for one, the hybrid nature of their armies. Like over here, I have certainly a lot more melee units than I have ranged units. That's kind of the theme you want to go for. So yeah, Dark Elves, number 5 for the reasons I listed. They get good. They get a bunch of heroes, including hags, death hags, that give them casualty replenishment. They're recovering their losses. They take less damage from the auto-resolve, and they can win a lot of auto-resolve battles that other races would just struggle with. At number 4, we have Kislev. For all the number of issues Kislev does have, Kislev can have a really good auto-resolve, or a really bad one, depends on what you're recruiting. Of course, if you're gonna get a bunch of regular constars, don't expect a great auto-resolve situation. However, if you do start recruiting armored constars and then Sargard, as well as other units like Streltsy, then your auto-resolve score does go up by quite a bit. And on top of that, these are tier 2 or tier 3 units, and for all the significant economic issues that Kislev has, you can afford to recruit a bunch of these armored constars and armored constars with great weapon, and Sargard. You're dealing with some really powerful factions, and one of the advantages that you do have is having heavily armored units that do make things a lot easier in auto-resolve. Might be a really difficult campaign start, but once you get the ball rolling with Kislev, it becomes absolutely freaking ridiculous. In particular, Warbear Riders as a monstrous cavalry unit with their 100 armor are absurd. On top of that, Kislev does have incredible leadership as well, and also Streltsy, who have, as a ranged unit, a very high level of armor as well. Not necessarily as much as Cafe, to be sure, but then again, Cafe does have the issue of Casualty Replenishment, which Kislev doesn't have a struggle with, because Kislev can increase their Casualty Replenishment hero capacity at tier 2 with Patriarchs, which does give them a significant level of power in terms of both Casualty Replenishment and just Autoresolve combined. Because it's one thing to have an army that can do well in Autoresolve, but if you can't recover from it, you're not really going to be in a great situation. Or you can even enable Celiac. But really, you can get to the Casualty Replenishment cap as Kislev relatively quickly in a campaign. Because being able to increase your Casualty Replenishment hero capacity at tier 2 is actually an incredible level of power that not many races or any other race really has access to. In fact, I'm just trying to think about it. Which other race increases their Casualty Replenishment hero capacity at tier 2? I got nothing. So, maybe you could, I suppose, consider Khorne? Yeah, I guess Khorne. That's it. But not really, because Khorne is just about, like, recruitment. You can get more hero capacity, sure, with Khorne early on in a campaign, but no, not even Khorne. That is one of the few strengths that Kislev does have as a race. Well, honestly, the army roster of Kislev is pretty damn absurdly broken in a lot of ways. At number 3, it would be the Warriors of Chaos, with a fairly significant asterisk associated with regards to that. See, Warriors of Chaos are Warriors of Chaos. They have some of the most heavily armored units in the game, and the amount of stuff that's over here is freaking absurd. But what I'm really looking at are these guys. You can get relatively quickly in a campaign, 100 level of armor. These guys are crazy, and then once you start talking about Chosen, it gets even crazier. Very high level of armor. And it gets to a point with Warriors of Chaos relatively quickly in a campaign where you can just auto-resolve effectively every single battle in a campaign. Don't forget things like the Armored Chaos Trolls, which also have a ridiculous level of armor and can be recruited fairly early on. But the asterisk comes down to this. You don't start by recruiting... you don't start by recruiting Warriors of Chaos. You start by recruiting Marauders, and then upgrading them at rank 5 to Chaos Warriors. Marauders are awful in Autoresolve, so you do have this kind of situation with Warriors of Chaos where you can take a significant number of casualties with some of your starting units, or early units, and you gotta be a bit careful with the way you're using your armies, but you might have that particular dynamic early on in a campaign, and then you're just demolishing everything that stands in your freaking path. It is genuinely freaking hilarious, the kind of bullshit that you can get up to when you're playing one of these campaigns. Casualty replenishment wise, it doesn't necessarily work in the same way it does for other races. But you do have a fairly solid enough casualty replenishment. Maybe not the best casualty replenishment in the game, to be sure, on that subject. Because you're not so much relying on a hero that gives you casualty replenishment, you're relying on certain effects, right? That, for instance, cast strategist, as opposed to getting stand or die, because why would you need stand or die when you got the 100 armor units? Yeah, it's just kind of, with very high leadership as well. Don't forget that aspect, because it's a question of leadership. Beyond that, the fact that the Warriors of Chaos are effectively a pure melee faction with just a couple of artillery or skirmisher units, just a very, very small amount of those, that also pushes the situation even further towards favoring them in Autoresolve. The Autoresolve, again, the Autoresolve results that you can get to Warriors of Chaos is so absurd that you can genuinely Autoresolve your way for the entire campaign without breaking a sweat. Just keep your Marauders alive so you can upgrade them, and that's roughly about all you need to know about this campaign, or any of Warriors Chaos campaign. On top of that, you have a bunch of regiments renowned with also absurd levels of armor, and yeah, casualty replenishment can be managed through the various authority systems that you do have. May not necessarily be the best casualty replenishment, but the amount of bullshit you're gonna get away with in terms of your Autoresolve results is such that you kind of don't necessarily care to the same extent. And also, if you're playing Undivided or Nurgle, you can get replenishment in foreign territory, which is always freaking awesome as well. There's also other things as well, like casualty replenishment 10% for Chaos Marauders. There's all kinds of benefits that you do have access to over here in Warriors of Chaos campaign. It is the Dwarves. Why do I say that? Well, I'll just use this example of a campaign. This is a campaign as Grombrindle. This is for turn 52, and yes, the amount of insanity that I've unleashed in this campaign on Legendary without any kind of like mod to, you know, help me out to win over here is absurd. You know what's even more absurd in this campaign? Just how many battles I've been able to auto-resolve as opposed to having to fight them manually. To be sure, this is only going to really work with Grombrindle in a way, or once you get Grombrindle, because you do have that 6% casualty replenishment all characters faction-wide. But keep in mind, you can confederate Grombrindle playing as any Dwarf Legendary Lord, so that kind of benefit is always going to be available in your campaign. It is fucking absurd. Especially once you do start considering the fact that you do have plenty of ways of getting casualty replenishment through heroes. Like you can get Felix fairly early on, then you can get Garagrim, then you can get the Dragon Slayer rather. There is a good amount of power with regards to that. But I just want to show you a statistic over here. So I have the battles over here. Total battles fought, 219. Battles fought personally, 10. Battles auto-resolve, 209. And total victories, 197. Yes, 197. So I did lose some battles, mainly minor settlements that were attacked, etc. All that kind of stuff. So yeah, total defeats 22. I lost some armies here or there, but the vast majority of battles I have won. And the vast majority, the overwhelming majority of battles in this campaign, I have auto-resolved. That is how absurd the dwarves are. Because almost every single dwarf unit that exists, with some exceptions like Slayers, but the mainline dwarf units have a fairly high level of armor. You start with dwarf warriors at tier 1 that have 85. Then you go into Longbeards at the higher tier that have 100. Slayers don't have armor because they're Slayers, but Longbeards Hammers do have armor. But that's not all. You have Ironbreakers with 125. You have the most heavily armored range units in the game, with things like Iron Drakes having 125, Quarrelers having 80. You get the point. Then you have armored flying units as well, with a fairly high level of armor. The sole reason that I'm not putting dwarves as on the highest possible place on this list, well, one of the reasons is that they're not actually the most ridiculous race over here. The other reason is that dwarf melee armies are not necessarily the best. What you really kind of want is a combination of ranged flying units, or you can just mass flying units. And that's where you start getting into the issues of diversifying your army ends up hurting you. You do want melee units. Going with pure range just leaves you open to being flanked in battles where you're fighting a number 2-1, or more likely than not, if you're fighting Skaven, 3-1. So you do need some melee units, but that actually doesn't create a great auto-resolve score. But then again, you might have a campaign situation like the one I found myself in, where Warzag was sending army after army after army over here, and I was just like, yeah, auto-resolving the crap out of him. The crazy part to consider with regards to all of this, dwarf garrisons are made up of these heavily armored units. So not only do your armies have a great auto-resolve score, your settlements, and keep in mind, all settlements have an auto-resolve benefit. That's just how the game works. What people have found in the code is that it's counting as having a couple of free towers in the settlement, and that's increasing the auto-resolve score. But when you have dwarf settlements that by default have a lot of these heavily armored units, it ends up being freaking ridiculous in terms of just like the kind of Autoresolve bullshittery that you might have. To give you an example here, there's this event at the Silver Pinnacle where you start getting endgame vampire armies spawning over here that you're supposed to deal with. Do you know how many battles I fought manually over here against the hordes of undead with this army and the garrison over here in Settlement? Zero. Zero. Oh, I may have lost a couple of units, mainly melee units in this army that was dealing with those vampires, but I also fought absolutely no battle manually. I auto-resolved my way through it. So yeah, dwarves are absurd. Just some issues because you're incentivized for the manual battles, the few ones they may have to fight. It depends on the campaign you're playing, right? Grombrindle is just an absurdly broken lord. He's not the norm, even for the dwarves. Grombrindle might be absurd. You would have to fight a larger share of battles, at least early on in other dwarven campaigns, especially with Malachi. But they do suffer a bit from that hybrid nature, because you do want ranged units, or you just want gyrocopters. You don't want to go pure melee. Though maybe that would be a smarter thing to go for these days with dwarves. Just range issues in the game. Like range units not firing properly, terrain issues, pathing issues, friendly fire. It's something you gotta see in the game to understand properly. It's just like, yeah, something that it can end up ruining campaigns. But regardless, yeah, dwarves are absurd. Not the most absurd though. No. Because then number one, it is Khorne. Melee focused race, so you don't have the same problems as you might in a dwarf campaign, or a Kislev campaign, or a Dark Elf campaign. Nor do you have the limitation with having to recruit Marauders and then upgrading them into Chaos Warriors as you do in a Warriors of Chaos campaign. You directly recruit Chaos Warriors, assuming you have a Mortal Settlement. And certainly the Mortals of Khorne are what are favored in any of the Khorne campaigns. It does create some issues in a Scarbrand and Skulltaker campaign, because they do start with demonic settlements. But still, the mortal units of Khorne are absurd. At any mortal settlement, you can recruit Chaos Warriors of Khorne directly. Not only do these guys have a very high level of armor, silver shields, they also have frenzy and spell resistance. Not sure how much any of that is going to count in Autoresolve, but let's just say Khorne's Autoresolve with Chaos Warriors of Khorne, a tier 1 unit, is already ridiculous enough. But then you have all the other units, Chaos Warriors of Khorne with halberds, Chaos Warriors of Khorne with dual weapons, Chosen of Khorne, Skull Reapers, Wrathmongers, Chaos Knights of Khorne. They are all pretty freaking ridiculous as units. Even units like Minotaurs of Khorne do fairly well in Autoresolve as monstrous infantry units. The demons do certainly suffer quite a bit in terms of their Autoresolve results, so Bloodletters in particular are the biggest losers with regards to Khorne roster. Marauders of Khorne don't do exceptionally well, though they do better than regular Marauders, just the level of armor that they do have, the level of durability and frenzy that they do have, so don't underestimate those. But yes, the melee-focused aspect of Khorne does certainly favor them quite a bit. The ease of getting Casualty Replenishment heroes at tier 2, getting 2 of them fairly early on in a campaign at tier 2 through the War Leaders research that gives you an extra cultist capacity is pretty damn strong. And then you increase that capacity at tier 3. So that is certainly a very significant benefit that you do have in a Khorne campaign. But that is not just all there is in a Khorne campaign as well. You then add in bloodletting. So understand that you already have a fairly high level of casualty replenishment with the Cultists of Khorne. But then you add in a high level of bloodletting, which increases your casualty replenishment by 10%. It is pretty charming and can be a bit tricky to get more than one army or a couple of armies with a high level of bloodletting. But again, even without bloodletting, you are still going to be in a pretty good position with regards to casualty replenishment in a Khorne campaign. It's just that extra edge that does end up benefiting you quite a bit. On top of that, because of how easy it is to switch to encamp stands, or demonic portal stands, if you will, in a Khorne campaign, you end up actually having quite a bit higher of a casualty replenishment, even as you are traversing across the world. The sheer amount of bullshit that you can get up to in a Khorne campaign is just, well, very damn significant. And it does end up being a fairly absurd situation when, you know, you can just show up with an army like this, beat it up, auto-resolve, win, and then, you know, go on to the next target, the next target, the next target, the next target. It is ridiculous. It is ridiculous, especially when you consider that in a Khorne campaign, you may be fighting multiple battles in the single turn, and you can auto-resolve all of those freaking battles. It is a ridiculous absurdity of a situation for them as a race. Particularly ridiculous, I would say, with Arbol, though. There's a reason Skulltaker was pretty damn broken, and still is pretty damn broken as a legendary lord. Khorne just ends up winning, and honestly, out of the cast factions, like the pure cast factions, not concerned Skaven or Beastmen, but like, you know, the warriors or the various mono gods, Khorne is the most dangerous one. Now, you might ask, rightly so, why exactly didn't I include Nurgle on this list? Because Nurgle does have some really good infantry as well, and certainly Nurgle has good casualty replenishment and melee focus. Well, the reason I'm not going to include Nurgle is the limitation on recruitment. Because getting entire armies of Chaos Warriors is possible in a Nurgle campaign, absolutely, it just takes a freaking while. Whereas the Warriors of Chaos in Khorne, you have just that much higher reliability of ensuring you have really good armies for the sake of auto-resolve. Whereas with Nurgle, it's a mixed bag, so to speak, as a race from that particular perspective. But either way, that's all I had to say. Questine signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications. If you're interested, I might do a video on the worst races in auto-resolve. Just to know Vampire Coast is the worst race in terms of auto-resolve for a damn good reason.